that the rhythms of Japanese history can be understood chiefly in terms of the relationship between Japan and its rather huge neighbor to the west, aka China. And then in the 19th and 20th century, it is the history of Japan and its relationship to other Westerners, particularly Tsarist Russia, Germany, France, and the United States, and Britain and the United States. So really, in the course of Japanese history, or at least recorded Japanese history, there are two Wests, China, and most importantly later, the Euro-American West. Now, at the beginning of any serious recorded records that are in writing, Japan in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries was a hodgepodge of little warlord kingdoms who were vying for control essentially of the southwestern part of Japan, which is essentially today Kyoto to Hiroshima, and particularly the Kyoto region, which eventually became Japan's first fully settled capital and represented the transition from a non-written civilization to a written civilization, or maybe a non-written culture to a written culture. And there are two primary things that mark that. There are plenty of others, but two primary things are: one, a settled capital with a dominant elite royal family that, according to mythology, we still have a sitting emperor who is the successor. His most famous antecedent is, of course, Hirohito, the Showa emperor, about which I will have something to say. And secondly, records that make the claim that this imperial line is the only imperial line possible in Japan. Now, that's an interesting thing because it's both a borrowing and significant modification of the Chinese view of the Chinese emperor and of the Chinese view of where the imperial city sits in relation to its surrounding urban countries, its urban surroundings. So first, by the time that Japan has settled into a hierarchical political order with an emperor at the top who claims to be the chief executive of the entire country because he's the descendant of the sun goddess. And of course, if you think about this in a very earth-centered way, there's nothing higher than the sun. The first book that was published in Japan, and it was written in Chinese with notations along the side that essentially translated it into Japanese syntax, was a book called The Record of Ancient Matters, or The Record of Ancient Events or Ancient Affairs. And that in Japanese is called Koji.
Sorry to interrupt. Dr. Levey, you are in and out of the screen, which is disconcerting.
Oh, I'm sorry. I keep thinking I need to hide my hair.
No,
Anyway.
don't worry about it.
All right. So I won't have to do my James Spann imitation.
No.
Okay. So this book is the official history of early Japan. It was published in the early 8th century. And it was literally meant to say, this line will always supply emperors and no one else can. So that means this line will rule Japan forever. And in China, as we all know, we're familiar with the notion that there were dynastic changes. So in China, any official history justified the existing dynasty until a new dynasty brought about the end of that dynasty, which then claimed it was the legitimate successor. So it's based on a Chinese concept, but it's a very narrow interpretation of it, so that it doesn't allow for, at least theoretically, the possibility of rebellion. And this notion became the centerpiece of Japanese historiography. That Japan never experienced rebellion, Japan never experienced civil war, hogwash baloney. Because it did, lots of times. But be that as it may, that's the central borrowing from China. And over the course of Japanese history, China was Japan's cultural reference point. And the obvious or most obvious example is the simple fact that Japanese borrowed Chinese characters. And they borrowed Chinese characters because they themselves, up until significant contact with China, had no written language. Now, the difference between Chinese and Japanese, or the key difference, there are many differences, is that Japanese is a highly inflected language. You conjugate verbs, and it's as inflected as German. That has nothing to do with their alliance in the 1930s and 40s, but it is an interesting coincidence. And Chinese is completely uninflected. You don't change anything. There are no, in English, there are no INGs. So that's a strange phenomenon. And it's a strange phenomenon simply because Chinese developed a character language as opposed to an alphabetic language. And Japanese, over the course of time, beginning not too long after this period of initial heavy contact, developed symbols that reflected or kind of act like letters, particularly for modification verbs. So throughout Japanese history, once you've absorbed characters, you've also created systems for transliteration. And the most important is hiragana, which does all the grammatical heavy lifting. And then katakana, which was done especially for English in the 19th and 20th centuries and other European languages. So one of the great things about going to Japan, at least the last time I was there way too long ago, watching Monday night football games, they showed only the plays, none of the in-between, so the game would last for like 10 minutes. And the game and the announcers, almost every word they said was transliterated English. Futboru, you name it. And so that's a peculiar phenomenon. To have, it would be like us having Chinese characters with INGs and past tense and present tense and future tense and so forth. And that has really gone a long way toward Japan's understanding of its place in the world, and Japan, more limited speaking, Japan's place in East Asia. Now, over the course of centuries, this initial period where a capital was built in the city we now know as Kyoto, they also built another capital for a variety of political reasons about 70 years later, called Heian. I'm sorry, that is the term they use to refer to Kyoto. Kyoto becomes Kyoto only when Tokyo becomes Tokyo. But anyway, that regime eventually falls apart. And it took several centuries. It transformed in certain fundamental ways, but eventually was overthrown by a series of Bakufu regimes, or as is often put in English, shogunates. And Bakufu literally means tent government, because soldiers, in Japanese samurai, lived in tents, obviously. The first of these regimes was the government was located in a small fishing village in the area around what is present-day Tokyo. The name of the village is Kamakura. And then the second was located actually in the city of Kyoto. And the third was located in the city of Tokyo, which at that time was called Edo. So there were three moments in time in what's often called medieval or feudal Japan, where military leaders governed the country. And because these were military leaders as opposed to the elite that was originally located in Kyoto or Heian, there's a very large perception, an enduring perception, that Japan has been a militaristic country for 1,000 years, which feeds into the mythology of Japan wanting to conquer the world for a good long time, which feeds into perceptions of Japan's behavior in the 1930s and 40s. Anyway, the third of these three Bakufu regimes, located in Edo, was established by a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu. And generally speaking, his Bakufu regime, his shogunate, lasted from approximately 1600, when it was first declared by the emperor, who was still in Kyoto, and collapsed in 1868, when a group of young samurai felt that the regime had failed them. And they actually had, in a variety of financial and economic, personal economic ways. So they made war on that regime starting in the 1860s and culminating in 1868, when this regime claimed Emperor Meiji as the emperor of the country, and moved the capital along with the emperor to the city they now call Tokyo, and set up a centralized nation-based bureaucratic regime based on the theory that Japan's emperor was the sovereign of the country. Now, one of the oddball things about Japanese history is that for only a very short time, roughly the 8th or 9th centuries, did emperors actually reign and rule. And in fact, the way in which the earliest imperial state was modified removed Japanese emperors from the daily affairs of political life. And in a sense, the constitution, based on the systems established by these young samurai in the 1860s, reflected that tradition, because Emperor Meiji was involved in the affairs of state only to the extent that he was one of the voting members of the cabinet. And he could, have the decisive vote on those occasions when it was necessary, such as December of 1941. But for the most part, was not a decider, not a policymaker. That was the cabinet. And the cabinet was divided essentially into 2.5 groups: civilian leaders and military leaders, which were divided then between the Army and the Navy. And that would turn out to be of huge significance by the time you get to the 1930s and the 1940s. So, to summarize what we've talked about to this point, Japan has had an imperial system that has mostly been reign but not rule, and has been ruled by military leaders, samurai, and then modern military leaders who might have, some of whom were descendants of former samurai, but many of whom were not. And that situation continued until 1945. We'll get to that when MacArthur and the American occupation makes a few significant changes. So over the course of the period of Emperor Meiji and his son, Emperor Taisho, and his son, Emperor Showa, aka Hirohito, essentially 1868 to 1945, the leadership obviously gets older, and eventually they're called Genro, which is usually translated as lofty leaders or something to that effect. And they rule the country until the end of the Second World War. Now, at several moments in time, Japan in the 1860s is in a situation vis-a-vis European and American empire builders, and we all know their names, felt threatened. And the leaders of the country realized at a certain point they needed to do a couple of things. First, become, as they call, a strong and wealthy country so that they could build up the economic and military infrastructure to prevent being colonized by Americans, Europeans, what have you. Excuse me. And two, to become a member of that club. And over the course of Japanese history, relations between China and Japan tended to be profitable to both sides. There was a period of time in the 18th and 17th centuries when Japanese pirates created lots of trouble for the then forming Manchu Empire known as Qing, which today is spelled, for reasons that still puzzle me, Qing. But anyway, beneath the surface of that, there were very cordial relations between China and Japan, but China started to get colonized, particularly as British imperialism in South Asia, aka India, etc., and in East Asia, particularly in China, where the Russians became very involved in the north, the French in the southeast, and the Germans a little bit in a city in northeast China, where we sometimes get wonderful beer called Qingdao. And be that as it may, by the end of the 19th century, China has, as is often put, been carved up like a melon. And the carving up of China is somewhat like what the European empires did to Africa about it in the 1880s at the Conference of Berlin, the partition of Africa, the scramble for Africa. There were different legal and administrative procedures instituted in Africa by the empire builders as opposed to China. But it was, what they did in both places was very effectively colonial operations. So by the 1880s, China and Japan are in very different situations vis-a-vis the emerging American empire, which dominated the Philippines and Hawaii, and the more traditional, longer enduring empires of the British, the French, and Tsarist Russia. And of course, Japan being located just off the northeast coast of China, the northeast being what we often call Manchuria. The Chinese, the Japanese, and the Russians had interests in that region. For the Qing, as Manchus, that was their homeland. For the Russians, that was ripe pickings for empire building, as it was for the Japanese. And in fact, one of the little known battles of what I call the long and last World War took place in 1938 and 1939 between the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan, which occupied Manchuria by that point, starting in 1931. On the eastern border of it and on the western border of it, which were both part of the Soviet Union. And as it turns out, General Zhukov of Moscow fame was the leader of those Soviet armies in East Asia and defeated the Japanese decisively both times. And the second one in March through May of 1939, just around the time Hitler is starting to negotiate with the Soviet Union over Poland, Japan is forced to retreat. from any intentions it had, and it certainly had them, particularly in the army. The army wanted to build an East Asian continental empire that essentially took away from the Soviet Union its East Asian territories. And that, for all intents and purposes, was off the table by 1939 because of the Soviet victories. And at that point, Zhukov was sent to Moscow by 1941, and he executed great stuff to prevent the Germans from defeating the Soviet Union. That's a whole nother ball of wax. But in the meantime, Japan harbored serious interest in Manchuria, particularly once it defeated the Russians in 1904 and 1905 in what's called the Russo-Japanese War, which was set up by a victory over the Chinese 10 years earlier in the Sino-Japanese War. From that point on, Japan wanted to control Manchuria. And over the course of time, it succeeded in doing so, particularly starting in 1931. By my estimation, I claim that the long and last World War, which we traditionally refer to as the Second World War, began at that moment, September 18th, 1931. 8 years before Germany invaded Poland, 10 years before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, 10 years before Japan invaded the colonies of the British, French, and America. And so all of that is part of what I call the long and last World War. Oh, and also, 8 years before Germany invaded. So I argue that Germany's invasion of Poland can be one of two dates in which the Second World War in Europe started. I tend to argue that the war in Europe started in 1936 because of Soviet and German involvement in the 3-year Spanish Civil War, which ended only a few months before Germany invaded Poland. And when you really think about it, there's a long First World War as well. The fighting in Western Europe definitely ended in 1918, but fighting that grew out of the First World War in Eastern Europe didn't end until 1925. And the chief component of that, obviously, was the Russian Civil War, which took place everywhere along the borders of the former Russian Empire, including East Asia. So over the course of the 1930s, Japan gains control of what we call Manchuria and what the Chinese call the 3 northeastern provinces. And so Manchuria itself is a politically loaded word that signifies the notion that Manchuria is not part of China. And in fact, that was exactly what the Japanese declared in 1932 when they put the last emperor of China, Emperor Puyi, and installed him as the emperor of the kingdom or empire of Manchuria or Manchuria. And he reigned until 1945, and he was obviously a puppet. Now, over the course of the 1930s, and this is another reason why I say it's a long and last World War that started in China, the Japanese continued to fight Chinese forces. The official Chinese army, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who in the United States is humorously referred to as cash my check. I like that phrase. He cashed a lot of American checks eventually. But the Japanese continued to fight in northern China, which was a strategic zone once they controlled Manchuria and declared it an independent state, independent from China. And so by 1936, Japan had not outright colonized northern China, but they had military control over it, and they forced upon Chiang Kai-shek a series of treaties that disallowed him from supplying any troops to any of the warlords of northern China. Remember, China had basically disintegrated, in part because of Euro-American and Japanese imperialism by 1911. So, and he couldn't send his troops into that region. So for all intents and purposes, by the end of 1936, several months before the outbreak of full-scale war in 1937, Japan controlled all of northern China, which was the heartland of Chinese civilization, going back 3 millennia. And of course, the Chinese were not happy about this. The Japanese were a vicious and cruel empire builder in China, and were the equivalent of the Nazis in its ability to kill massive quantities of people. And the only difference is, as is true with the Soviet Union, they didn't kill people in gas chambers. They did everything else the Nazis did. They did everything else the Soviet Union did. The 3 greatest blights on human history were Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, particularly the Stalinist Soviet Union, and Imperial Japan. So despite the fact that the Japanese did not want to really engage in full-scale war with Chiang Kai-shek and his armies, and they didn't, because of their experience with the Soviet Union. They didn't want to put all their forces in China and leave their border with the Soviet Union relatively unprotected. And that was a huge problem. And it was a huge problem made worse by the fact that throughout the 30s, Chiang Kai-shek's primary supporter was Joseph Stalin. We did pretty much nothing until 1941. And even the Germans supported China to the extent that it wanted to continue gaining precious minerals for its military war making capacity from China. And it was really only until 1940 when the Japanese joined the Pact of Steel with Mussolini and Hitler, the Tripartite Pact of 1940, that Germany stopped trading and stopped allowing military support for China. And it's only at that moment that the US steps in as Chiang Kai-shek's primary supporter start sending lend-lease. China and the Soviet Union would end up being two of the primary recipients of American lend-lease aid. The obvious one was Great Britain. We tend to forget about the Soviet Union and China. And those monies and equipment were helpful to both the Chinese and the Soviets to stay into the war. The Soviet Union claims that it had no effect, that they did it all on their own. There's a grain of truth to that, because most of the lend-lease aid the Soviet Union received was after Stalingrad. So by the time the Soviets were on the offensive in a sustained way in 1943, it was only then that the armaments fully motorized the Soviet army to a degree that the German army in 1941 was not. It was a fully mechanized army, and it helps explain why the Soviet Union was able to sustain its war-making capabilities all the way to Berlin. In China, the story was somewhat different, but there was help, and that help helped Chiang Kai-shek and, to a certain degree, the Communist Party of China keep Japan fighting in China all the way to 1945. So the Japanese were prevented by Chinese resistance from engaging its full armies against the Americans. And so part of what helped America provide the decisive contribution to victory over Japan was that they always had to fight a much smaller Japanese army on every island they fought. And thank goodness for that. But of course, the Chinese sacrifice is very unknown today, although scholars are starting to pay much more attention to it. Scholars today are much more aware of the Soviet contribution to victory. To put it into perspective, by August of 1944, the Soviet Red Army was near Warsaw, just as we were breaking out of the beachhead we established at Normandy. So at roughly the same time, the Red Army had pushed about as far, if not farther, to Berlin than our armies, the United French, British, and American armies. Could the Soviet Union have defeated Germany on its own? Maybe, but it didn't happen that way. It was a coalition victory. Who took Berlin? The Soviet Union. Why? Stalin wanted it, and Eisenhower said, have at it, it's yours. We're not going to waste our blood and treasure on that. And that was a politically calculated move that reflected the American view that America could win on the backs of Soviet blood and treasure. And they did. And that's why Europe was divided. Europe was not divided at Yalta. Europe was divided at Yalta only to the extent that that was the natural consequence of decisions made as early as 1941 and 1942 in Washington, whatever your feelings about that might be. So the coalition wins. The coalition survives because neither side is willing to make a separate peace with Germany or Japan. And in fact, there were overtures by Germany and Japan through 1945 to sign separate surrender documents, and the Soviet Union refused. And the Americans at the Casablanca conference, it's very, one of the unknown participants of the Casablanca conference was Mr. Rick. He was there. That's a joke. Monsieur Rick. Anyway, Casablanca fans. President Roosevelt sort of willy-nilly announced the policy of unconditional surrender. And that was an extremely effective thing. It was a response to 1918, and it ensured that Germany would fight to the bitter end, just as Japan did. My favorite European World War II movie is called Fury. It came out a few years ago, and it shows that the Germans were just as willing to sacrifice themselves as the Japanese kamikaze pilots, although they did surrender in larger numbers. So as we all know, the war ended in early May of 1945 in Europe, when the Germans signed an American doc-sponsored surrender conference in France, and then a Soviet-sponsored conference in Eastern Berlin, or what would become East Berlin. And then because Stalin promised that the Soviets would invade Manchuria, the Americans wanted that because they were really slugging it out with the Japanese on those islands. But by the time August came around, they realized they didn't need Japanese support. And that's one of the main reasons why we dropped the atomic bomb once 2 days before, and for the second time, 1 day after the target date of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, August 8th. So the end of the Second World War in East Asia was prompted by both the 2 atomic bombings and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. So the war comes to an end, and that effectively seals the Soviet ability to, or prevents the Soviet ability to occupy Japan. And that was a good thing, because we know the division of Germany was the outcome in Europe, and the division of Japan did not take place. So you have your Nuremberg trial, you have your Tokyo war crimes trials, you have trials of lower level Nazis in Europe, you have trials of lower level fascist, imperialist Japanese throughout China and Southeast Asia. And then you have the divided occupation and the eventual creation of West Germany and East Germany. And you have the singular occupation of Japan under General MacArthur, who governs the country until he goes to Korea in 1950, until 1951, when the formal occupation of Japan ends and Japan becomes a sovereign nation once again. And it acts as a sovereign nation, but it does not act as an imperial nation because its army has been denied it by Article 9 of the new Japanese Constitution, which stipulates that it could have no military. But by the time of the communist civil war against Chiang Kai-shek and its victory, that was no longer of interest to the Americans, and the Americans insisted that they develop their own army, which they did. And the Japanese were taking advantage of the United States by saying, well, okay, we're going to have our army, but we're not going to send it anywhere. And that turned out to be a major decision for the Japanese government. Over the course of time, by the 1980s, Japan, particularly Japan's conservative leadership, who dominated the Liberal Democratic Party, which was neither liberal nor democratic, under the leadership of then Prime Minister Nakasone, who wanted to get rid of the Article 9 and other stipulations of the post-war American written Japanese Constitution. We wrote it, and we translated it into Japanese. So it was in fact a very Rooseveltian Democratic Party kind of constitution, which guaranteed rights for women, which we don't, or if we do, there are other stipulations in the Constitution that must be applied. So at that point, Japan became our friend. And the irony is not lost on Koreans, or Filipinos, or anybody else in Southeast Asia, the Vietnamese. And in fact, again, ironic, we're fighting in Vietnam, we're fighting in Korea earlier. And in both instances, Japanese troops are sent to those places, not in large numbers, but just enough for people to notice. And those wars end, we can't say victory, but something other than that. And Japan has become a more assertive country because the left wing of Japan, for the most part, has been incapable of coalescing into a serious coalition government. It had its heyday in the early 90s. That's about it. It's been LDP almost for the entire post-war period. And that brings us to the present day. And Japan is one of our most solid allies. China obviously is a rival. Our chief rival, after Maoist insanity, China's become a very practical empire builder, and it seeks to dominate East Asia. And it seeks to do so based on the fact that the Qing dynasty was dominant throughout East Asia, essentially continental and maritime, Indian Ocean and east into the South China Sea, which is really the center of tensions today. And those tensions will continue for the foreseeable future. Russia and China are making nice. For a while, we had Russia on our side, but we misplayed our hand in Russia, and Russia has become, a real rival. The question of war is a very real one. I think a major component of war will be cyber warfare. How much a future war, should it happen, would be, naval, air force, and army is hard to gauge. I think the Ukraine crisis has raised these issues seriously, but China's growth as an empire has done so as well. So I'm a historian. I don't engage in prognostication. I'm not a prophet, although everything I say is true. You know. So I will end there and open up for questions and speak as loudly as you can.
You mentioned that one of the problems the Japanese army had was that it was being tied up by the Chinese. I always thought that one of the major components to weakening the Japanese army against us was the presence of the Russian troops on the Manchuria border. But you didn't mention that, so I was wondering what role you think that
All right,
played.
there was one treaty that I failed to mention. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, it was obvious to Stalin and his leadership, who totally messed it up, that they didn't want to be attacked by Japan at the same time. And the Japanese agreed to a neutrality pact, which was essentially a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in April of 1941. And that was another factor in Japan's decision to go south against the Americans, British, and French, as opposed to what the army wanted to do, which was to go into Eastern Soviet Union. Now, the person who made the Pearl Harbor plans was General Yamamoto. And he knew, like everybody else in Japan's leadership, that the Japanese would lose, or the best that they could hope for would be a settlement with the Americans. And there was no way that settlement was going to happen. So that's why I called Japan's decision to invade, to attack Pearl Harbor and invade the Western colonies throughout Southeast and East Asia, including an attempted invasion of India in 1944, as insane. It's probably not the best word to use if you're trying to be a, historian who's not making too many judgments. But I'm comfortable with it because the Japanese leadership, the German leadership, and the Soviet leadership were so willing to kill other people and their own people. I can't think of that as anything other than insane, aside from being murderously cruel. So that neutrality agreement held force until August 8th, 1945, when the Soviet Union invaded Japan-occupied Manchuria. And Japan was sending signals, oh, please, please, let's keep that going, let's keep that going. And Stalin knew he had all the cookies in the jar and said, so that's that helps explain why the Japanese ultimately signed an unconditional surrender document.
So can I ask a question? What's the relationship between China and Japan today?
It's very fraught with tension. The Chinese pump up Japanese aggression, and it's their right to pump up Japanese aggression because the Japanese were the aggressors in basically from 1895 through 1945. But as all countries are apt to do, they ignore Chinese cruelty to their own people. So the great famines of the 1950s, you're not allowed to talk about that in China. Not allowed to talk about the Cultural Revolution in any way other than to suggest that it provided the transition to the essentially the inheritors of the current leadership. And that's a twisted argument, the details of which I don't need to get into. But basically, just as the Great Fatherland War in the Soviet Union, or the Eastern Front as we call it, and the Great War, anti-Japanese war of aggression in China, those are the two main events that Chinese and post-Soviet Russians talk about. So when they write their histories, they don't pay a lot of attention to Western Europe, because that would be paying attention to things they weren't involved in. So it's very tense. China makes it very tough for Japan, and Japan does not want to lose its position in the American alliance in relation to China.
I have just one more point I thought I would like to make, if you don't mind. You alluded to the fact that the German army ended up just as fanatical as the Japanese army, which I think was true for the most part. And a lot of times during the war and shortly after the war, they just had a reputation of being such great soldiers, and what a substantial army they were. But the point really was that they were largely hooked on Pervitin, which was crystal meth,
Yes.
which was actually given out by the German government to the army to keep them all pretty much hooked on it. So it was a nation of crackheads,
Yep.
including the army and
Yep.
civilians that we
Yep.
were fighting. And it wasn't that they were so, fanatical and for Hitler. It was that they were doped up.
So I'll just respond by saying it was drug-induced insanity, not just insanity.
You see the Chinese as having territorial ambitions that extend beyond Taiwan.
Yes, they want to control Southeast Asia, particularly the South China Sea, because the South China Sea gives you the entryway into the Indian Ocean. And back in the day, the Chinese were the most important geopolitical actor in the Indian Ocean and in the South China Sea. They didn't colonize India. They didn't colonize Southeast Asia. They didn't colonize West Asia. Okay. But they were they could have, should the situation had demanded it of them.
Well,
And they
really
never did that, but they can project even greater military power into that region today.
Yeah, the question really is, do you see them as going beyond what you've described and actually annexing additional territory to China other than Taiwan?
They've created little islands in Southeast Asia that gives them control of the South China Sea. I don't see them annexing Vietnam, Southeast Asia, I don't see them annexing Cambodia, Burma, India, etc.
Well, isn't the South China Sea really their Gulf of Mexico?
It's exactly right. That's how they look at it. That's exactly right.
Returning to Japan, Japan was relatively unknown until, at least to us, until the Americans entered Japan in what, 1850 or thereabouts. Why wasn't Japan out there looking and out on the sea? They had boats and people to sail them, but they were not. They were pretty much island bound.
Two things. One, Europeans knew about Japan as far back as the 17th century, when the Catholic Church sent out various missionary orders
The black ship.
on to East Asia on the theory that if they could convert the Chinese and the Japanese, then the Islamic threat would be reduced, because China and Europe would effectively surround the Islamic world. And China was engaged with the Islamic world very heavily for centuries, as far back as Muhammad's time, or at least as far back as caliphates, which are essentially Islamic empires. So in the Tang dynasty, in the middle of the 8th century, the Chinese and the Islamic Caliphate fought a major battle that effectively split much of Central Asia to giving much of Asia to giving Central Asia to the Islamic Caliphate. That's why China has a significant Islamic population that it cruelly mistreats the Uyghurs. And two, the Chinese Empire, the Tang, almost collapsed because of that defeat. So Europeans were aware of China and Japan. Americans weren't, because there wasn't an America yet. Yes, by the 19th century, America became heavily involved in relations with Japan because it wanted to use Japan as an extended coal fuel station as America was expanding its empire into the Pacific. And then we became one of the major empires of Southeast Asia, although our colonial territories.
It's been lovely to have you, Dean. Yeah, and I'm glad things go. Yeah, thank you.
Can't hear you.
For you too. Thank you.
Ron, turn off your sound. I got the idea, though, that Japan was content for centuries to be an inward-looking nation and didn't think anybody had anything to offer it because they were so advanced. And that when Dewey sailed into Manila Bay with a battleship and fired a few guns to show what they could do, it scared the hell out of them. And they had a huge metamorphosis and realized they were going to have to modernize and
Right.
cope with the rest of the world.
That's exactly right.
And so my question is Japan's action from that point on more, and they hadn't done any real colonization or imperial activities that I know of, but could you say that threat or sobering realization of their actual status compared to the rest of the world was what motivated them to change so much, and that from then on the military took over, or the more aggressive political forces took over, and it was downhill from there?
Yes, you're 100% correct. I wouldn't use the word takeover until the late 20s or early 30s. But yeah, military elites came to dominate Japan's political system, certainly from 1928, and undoubtedly, I don't know if there's a difference there, arguably since 1928 and undoubtedly since 1931. But military influence on the Japanese government was pretty strong from certainly 1895 on. But a takeover kind of thing, certainly by 1931. The other thing, there was some of the phrasing you were using suggested to me that you were talking about China as well as Japan. China inward looking, doesn't need anything from anybody else. There's a famous statement made by an 18th century Chinese emperor, excuse me, who said, we don't need to trade with you Brits, we got everything we need. And that's been misinterpreted into a sense of, the Chinese, they're closed-minded, they're up in the celestial, not down here on Earth. And that's absolutely not the case. China had relations with everybody within their sphere of influence, you might say, throughout its history. It was never closed off.
Yeah,
And part of it is it couldn't be closed off because there were continental threats to it throughout its history. Most particularly the Mongols. They were a threat. So that's why they built a wall. And a wall suggests I want to close off, but the wall was south enough that they were never closed off.
I think
That it? Going once, going twice.
Matt, the
So-
Japanese were always so vicious. I mean, like the rape of Nanking, and during World War II, you always saw pictures of movies about how vicious they were. And was that always the way they were? I mean,
No. So during the 30s and 40s, they were as vicious as the Nazis and the Bolsheviks. Okay? However, they observed the rules of law before that. So something changed, and it was a gradual change, reflected in, to a great degree, by the militaristic education Japanese students got when they went to school. And over the course of the 20th century, their education became more and more militarized, so that by the time they were in the army, universal conscription, they were taught to be cruel. And cruel they were, but not before then.
That relative to China and it trying to be an empire builder, my impression is that the Vietnamese and the Koreans and that group of countries absolutely hate the Chinese. And so I don't understand how they could possibly overcome that.
That's definitely true today. I don't think they're gonna conquer Korea. I don't think they're even gonna attempt it. I don't think they're gonna do Vietnam either. I don't think they really want to literally occupy other people's territory. They want to control trade. They want to use their military to control trade. Okay, and that's their way of reducing the strategic the global strategic power of the United States. So they're not going to conquer, Burma, or they're not going to conquer Singapore, okay, the way they did in the 1940s. But they're going to say, oh, you don't play our ball game, you lose your trade. And that could really create huge problems.
Dr. Levey, do you see the incursion into Africa, Kenya, and Mozambique, other parts of the world where they establish colonies, significant numbers of Chinese, and unlike the British, when they're no longer wanted, the Chinese don't leave?
Well, the British left because the British couldn't control the region. There was no serious British politician, including Winston Churchill, who wanted to give up the British Empire. It had run its course. The Chinese are probably more powerful in Africa than anywhere else outside their own national borders. And they are engaged in exactly the same kind of aggressive treaty politics that the European empires engaged with China in the 19th and 20th centuries. That is, create massive debt so that the only people who can service their debt are the Chinese, and they can take over industry. They don't have to outright colonize Eastern Africa, but they can do sort of what the Europeans did to China in Africa. Now, one of the funny things historically, once you talk about Africa, is that there was a moment in the 15th century where if China's armada of ships, usually referred to as treasure ships, led by an Islamic Chinese eunuch named Zheng He, if they had crossed the Cape of Good Hope, they could have gotten into the Atlantic and rewritten the history of the last 500 years. That didn't happen. But the Chinese saw the entire Indian Ocean, the western edge of which was Africa, as part of their trading zone. And the Chinese today do so as well in a much more aggressive way. Well, thank you very much. I had fun. I hope you had fun. I hope you enjoyed stuff. And I
Marcia,
hope
you're
that-
muted.